Okay. All right. Then Sue, it's over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, welcome everybody. I have in the chat put my email address. Obviously, there were a lot of 1820 settlers, and the law of averages, the ones I'm going to mention are probably not the ones that you're interested in. So if there's any particular question that you want to ask, then send me an email afterwards. If I can answer it, I will. If I can't, I won't, but I'll do my best. So after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, those British soldiers who survived found an economic crisis at home and very few jobs to return to. And to make matters worse, in 1815, the British government passed the Corn Laws, which levied taxes on imported grain in order to protect the interests of the landowners. Wheat was in short supply following several bad harvests, and the price of bread became prohibitive for the working classes. At this time, all responsibility for poor relief fell on the parish authorities. The Spieneland system, dating from 1795, was a top-up system based on the price of a loaf of bread and the number of children in the household. But in practice, the wages of those in work, especially in agriculture, tended to remain low, as employers left it to the parish authorities to augment starvation wages. And it was also said at the time that the system encouraged couples to have more children so the family could claim more poor relief. Now, in the carve-up of land following the Congress of Vienna at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the Cape of Good Hope was ceded to Britain and was ruled by a governor under the jurisdiction of the Colonial Office. And the Colonial Secretary at this time was Lord Bathurst, who in July 1819 persuaded the British government to put £50,000 into an emigration scheme. So that's about £5 million in today's money. And his deputy at the Colonial Office was Henry Goulburn. And it was to these two men that all applications to emigrate to the Cape of Good Hope were written between July and December 1819. Now, the 1820 settler scheme was designed to fulfill three main functions. Firstly, it would establish the supremacy of the English-speaking settlers over the Dutch. Secondly, by concentrating the new settlements in the eastern part of the province, the Colonial Office hoped to establish a strong farming community capable of withstanding the border raids of the native Xhosa, thus increasing the security of the colony. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, as far as the government of the day was concerned, the emigration scheme was designed to boost popularity at home at a time of rising unemployment, a trade recession following the wars in Europe, and general social unrest. The scheme was announced in the Times on the 17th of July, 1819. The Colonial Department wanted to make sure that the land in the Cape would only be granted to those with enough capital and expertise to develop it. So when the scheme was first announced, it was restricted to organised parties of 10 or more men, selection being given to men who could afford to engage and maintain a party of at least 10 able-bodied labourers over the age of 18. The head of each party would receive a free passage and food on the journey, and on arrival would be given 100 acres of land for each man in the party. If they cultivated the land for 3 years, they would be given full title, and the £10 deposit required from each man prior to departure would be refunded in instalments after arrival, either in cash or in relations to tide them over until the first harvest. But note the paragraph here, it says, there may be a redundancy of population. The dreadful phrase which all the parish authorities used. They didn't want to pay them poor relief, so they were redundant. And there's also an interesting paragraph at the bottom. There was a rider that if the land they gave to the settlers happened to be on any valuable mines or land that was needed for roads, well, then they had to give it back. So I descend from 3 of the 1820 settlers from Westbury in Wiltshire, who emigrated with assistance from the parish. And the original correspondence from those who applied to join the emigration scheme is held at the National Archives in London, where I had already gone to read the correspondence of Samuel James, the leader of the Westbury contingent. And I received a great deal of help in tracing my ancestors from members of the old South African Roots Web mailing lists. And wishing to put something back, I decided I would try to transcribe the rest of the settler correspondence. This is when I discovered that there were 6 huge boxes containing thousands of letters from would-be applicants, only a fraction of whom were accepted onto the scheme. The letters, however, contained a wealth of family history, as well as social information about the plight of the common man in 1819, in particular the fate of the discharged servicemen. And so, with the help of some volunteers from the former Roots Web list, I photographed all the letters, coordinated their transcription, and eventually put them online on the eGGSA site at this address. So this is the homepage of the 1820 Settlers section of the eGGSA site. The link to the original letters of application written in 1819 can be found on the left-hand side. Letters written by actual settlers are marked as such, and their names in the correspondence are highlighted in red. Original spelling has been preserved throughout, no thanks to the Microsoft spell checker. And some correspondents were barely literate, and the spelling is colourful to say the least. It's also interesting that in 1819, many of what we would today think of as American spellings were common in the UK. The majority of correspondents signed off, "I have the honour to be your humble servant," without a U in honour. Other spellings reflected the Cockney London speech with "I ham" for "I am," etc. And some words also had slightly different meanings in 1819. The settlers talk about the government giving encouragement to settlers, which today we might take to mean moral support or approval, but in those days referred to tangible financial help. So this is an example of a letter written by someone who did not emigrate, but was desperate to do so. And you notice at the top, the address, Broadway, near the Turnpike Gate, Frome, Somersetshire. Apart from in very big cities such as London, the addresses were very vague like that. Sir, I am a poor man, have lost an hand, but can work as well as many who are called able-bodied. I have made bold to address you, praying your lordship to inform me if I can be allowed to proceed as a settler to the Cape of Good Hope. I am your lordship's most obedient humble servant, James Cabell. I am 34 years of age, have a wife and 2 children. Lost my hand on board HMS Windsor Castle on the 28th of October, 1805. Receives a pension of £14 per year. Well, James Cabell died in Frome in 1838. He never went to the Cape. I learned this from a descendant who had no idea he had lost a hand while serving in the Navy. But I think you'll see why I considered it important to put all the letters in the public domain. Descendants would give their eye teeth for a lot of this information, but because the people concerned didn't in the end go to South Africa, their descendants would never think of looking in the files relating to the Cape of Good Hope in the National Archives in London. Google searching has already united quite a few such descendants with copies of letters in their ancestors' handwriting, which for me makes it all worthwhile. Now, because parishes wished to get rid of what they termed their redundant population to avoid poor relief, many letters were written by vicars or overseers, listing whole groups of would-be emigrants, and in the case of Frome in Somerset, the correspondence of a Mr. T. Bunn amounts virtually to an 1819 census of Frome. In practice, very few succeeded in emigrating. A small Frome contingent was accepted under the leadership of a half-pay officer. Yes, this is the Frome contingent. The correspondence files here are full of letters like this with names of the would-be emigrants and their addresses and details of their family. And many of the letters were written by individuals wishing to emigrate, and they did not really understand the necessity of applying in parties of at least 10. So they were summarily rejected. Even those who applied correctly to take out a party of settlers were kept hanging on for a shameful length of time. Most of the letters were extremely polite and ingratiating, pleading their cause. But this letter is one of only 3 anonymous letters in the collection, which gives an interesting insight into what it must have been like to wait for news of the Colonial Office's decision. My lord, the protracted suspense in which you keep us poor emigrants is alike hurtful to our property and feelings. Your lordship knows what description of persons the government consider most eligible. Therefore, when a list is presented, why not say at once if it is or is not accepted? This would enable the applicants to prepare for quitting this country or to look after work if they remain in it. Quarter day is fast approaching. The poor man must either continue his house or give it up. If he continues it and should be amongst the elect number, he must forfeit a quarter's rent or break his engagement with the person leading the party. If he gives it up and should be amongst those rejected, he and his family are destitute of a residence. This incertitude is equally oppressive upon those men undertaking to lead parties. They are at a considerable expense in forming engagements with their workmen. These engagements can only be conditional, as your lordship will not tell them whether they really can go, and these workmen's necessities will not allow a day of their letting work pass them in vague hopes only. Therefore, should the engaging party's offer be at last accepted, when he comes to look for his people, one tells him he waited until tired and then took a long job which he cannot leave. Another says the time is too short to dispose of my furniture to any advantage, and without which I cannot provide necessaries for my children, therefore I will not go. Thus the person engaged is obliged a second time to procure people, and the list first sent to your lordship must be altered accordingly, and all this at the moment when he should be purchasing what is necessary for himself and people, both on the passage and after being landed at the colony. If it is intended that the £50,000 granted by Parliament should do the greatest good to the men for whom it is meant to be expended, I humbly conceive your lordship should say to those persons offering to lead parties, and who may be eligible for your offer of taking so many people to the Cape, is accepted, provided the men are of such and such descriptions. However, if the whole is only a political measure intended to form a barrier against the Kaffirs, in order to enable government to lessen or withdraw altogether the military posts on that frontier, the interest of the settler need not be so assiduously attended to, as the poorer a man is, the less reluctance he generally has to become a soldier or militiaman. But even in this case, it would only be justice in your lordship to give the people going out a hint of it, in order that they may not lay out all their little fortune on domestic and farming necessaries, but reserve a part to furnish munitions of war, so that when their Kaffir neighbours pay them a visit, more efficient response than pitchforks and spades may be at hand. I am your lordship's very humble servant, a proposed emigrant. Well, that last paragraph proved remarkably prophetic. But not everybody wanted to go. Thomas Maddox and his wife Susanna were accepted as settlers in a party from Westbury in Wiltshire under the leadership of Charles Hyman, and appear on the early party lists. Obviously, with an undertaking of this magnitude, people did change their minds about emigrating, and there were quite a few last-minute changes to party lists. But this letter from Thomas Maddox reveals a great marital discord over the issue. Honoured Sir, I am extremely sorry to inform you that my wife, having heard an unfavourable account respecting the Cape of Good Hope, she has for her part declined going, and even gone to the heads of the parish to prevent my selling any part of the goods which will prevent my going, except I may be allowed to go alone with the little money I can make without selling things here, which will, I hope, be about £3. I am very willing to go myself and can work my passage there, having served nearly 12 years in the Portsmouth Division of Marines, during which time I acquired some knowledge of shoemaking, and I would turn my hand to anything to render myself useful, both whilst going over and after my arrival at the Cape, so that I may never become troublesome to the government after my arrival at the place. Should I be favoured with a passage, and I am required at any future time to take up arms in defence of the government, I shall be ready to do it. The company I was to go with was Charles Hymans, to whom I beg you will address as follows by return of post, if possible, as his return must be made on Thursday next. I remain with greatest respect your very humble servant, Thomas Maddox. And then he says at the end, P.S. I hope you will allow me to go, as I am very anxious to go alone, if my wife will not. Well, the wife won. It's interesting to note that on the 1841 census, Thomas and Susan were still living together as weavers in Dilton Marsh, but they didn't appear to have any further children after 1819. However, I know that you're all interested in the settlers who did go to the Cape. And obviously most settlers are listed purely as names, ages, and professions in the list provided by their party leaders, though some are mentioned more fully in the leaders' letters. But because so many applications were rejected, however, many who were really keen to emigrate simply party hopped until they found a group that was accepted. And to facilitate finding such letters, I compiled an Excel file, which can be downloaded from the eGGSA site. And if you go to settler data tables, then you come up with the settler correspondence index, which looks a bit like this. You see the name of the settler. There's a column for correspondence, if they are listed, if they wrote correspondence themselves. If they applied to lead a party themselves, then there's a yes in that column. If they're listed in applications by other leaders, or if they're mentioned in any particular correspondence, other than just in the party lists in the parties with which they eventually emigrated. And then it gives the eventual party and the ship. So that might help you find any letters written by your ancestors. And these settlers all originally applied to take out a party of men by themselves. So they all eventually emigrated under other parties, but you can find letters of application in their handwriting. And this is an example of how these letters appear in their transcribed form on the website. The original letters aren't on the website themselves, although if anybody does find a letter and really wants a copy of it, then contact me and I might be able to let them have it. This is one of several letters written by John Brown of Clark's party, this one to his MP, and shows the type of frustration which was mentioned by the anonymous would-be emigrant. John Brown and John Stubbs eventually abandoned their own application and joined forces with William Clark. And the reference number at the top shows you where you can find it in the file at Q, and the last one is the page number. They're in a huge box, and they tend to be in order of receipt. So you need to look for the correct page number. And this is a letter written by Stephen Brown of Cox Party, who originally applied to take out a party consisting almost entirely of his own family members. And it gives a huge amount of genealogical information. The humble application of the 10 undermentioned persons who wish to emigrate to the British settlements at the Cape of Good Hope, according to the regulation and plan of your lordship. Stephen Brown, distiller, wine cooper, etc., age 40. Sarah Brown, wife of the above, age 36. Lydia Brown, daughter of the above. Stephen Brown, age 16. Nathaniel Brown, son of Stephen Brown, aged 11. Mary Ann Brown, daughter of Stephen Brown, aged 8. William Brown, son of Stephen Brown, aged 4 years. Elizabeth Cornfield, sister of the above Stephen Brown, having an income of £30 per annum, aged 44. Benjamin Brown, Jr., baker, aged 21. Thomas Hillman, coppersmith and tin worker, aged 25. Edward Hillman, brother of the above Thomas Hillman, aged 13. Nathaniel Hillman, shoemaker, aged 22. Those are all his family members. Then there are a few more single people And finally, Thomas Brown Sawyer, aged 46, Samuel Brown, son of Thomas Brown, aged 14, Thomas Brown, son of Thomas Brown, aged 12. The above-mentioned persons are all healthy and able-bodied men, having a small capital. My fervent prayer to Almighty God that your Lordship may be pleased to accept this our humble application. Now, only Stephen and his wife and youngest son, William, actually sailed on the Weymouth, but many of the others mentioned went out later to join him. And this letter was written by Richard Forrester and shows that he originally intended to take out a party jointly with Samuel Liversidge and several others. It says, "Sir, availing ourselves of the advantages we may receive from the circular letter which government holds out to those who wish to emigrate, we beg leave to offer our services to the colony of the Cape of Good Hope to become settlers. We are all able-bodied men. I, Samuel Liversidge, farmer, aged 29, having a wife and 3 children, all under 14 years of age. And I, Richard Forrester, wheelwright and farmer, aged 31, having a wife and 3 children, all under 14. And I, James Clark, aged 30, having a wife and 2 children, all under 14. And I, Samuel Ravenscraft, single, James Forrester, ditto. Philip Harper, ditto, all farmers. We have to beg you will be so kind as to inform us the manner in which we are to act to obtain a passage and where we are to embark and in what ship and the particulars of our embarkation. Richard Forrester wishes to know if it is requisite to bring his tools as wheelwright and to know if any weight of baggage is an obstacle." And you'll notice in the bottom corner, that rather spidery writing is Henry Goulburd's writing. He made notes on a lot of the letters as to how his clerks were to answer them. And at the foot is written, "His proposal not conforming to the circular cannot be considered." This is part of Robert Pirie's application. He eventually joined Wilson's party, as did many of the names on his schedule: Theophilus Gifford, William Kidson, John Carter, John Wybrew, Robert Horn, James Rathbone, John Williams, Thomas Foden, Charles Lucas, and Thomas Nelson. So they all did eventually emigrate, but originally applied to go with Robert Pirie. Now, many of the settlers had their expectations about life in the new colony dashed upon arrival. I'm very lucky that in 1983, an article appeared in the Eastern Cape Evening Post with the reminiscences of a then 95-year-old East London woman, Rhoda Ekron, who was a granddaughter of Selina Hayward, my 3 times great-grandmother, who arrived with James's party as a young girl. Mrs. Ekron could remember sitting on her grandmother's knee and listening to her accounts on the journey from England. She wrote, "My grandmother said they were taken on an open ox wagon to the Bathurst district. It rained heavily along the way, and they all had to huddle together for warmth. They'd been told they were going to new homes, so they expected to be given houses. My grandmother said it was a shock when they were offloaded next to a large boulder and told that this was their new home. For a long time they lived under a tree until they could build a house. That took a long time because they first had to make their own bricks." And in fact, later in the article, she says that they also she learned how to make shoes. They were a hardy lot, the early settlers. Now, when I first offered my transcriptions of the settler correspondence to eGGSA, Richard Ball used a computer program to convert my single very large Word file into individual pages for each correspondent. This worked well, but occasional glitches linked a letter to the wrong correspondent. And rather than constantly responding to my emails containing corrections, Richard gave me editing rights over the 1820 section and also the newspaper extract section containing my transcriptions from the Grahamstown Journal. And I still run these 2 sections today. After a while, I realized that many settler trees contained false information regarding where the settlers came from in the UK. For example, often the wife who emigrated was a second wife and not the mother of the older children, but in the past, researchers had used the old IGI and latched on to an earlier marriage where the bride had the same first name as the second wife and presumed that this must be the correct one. Because I have access to a lot of original parish registers and other documents in the UK, I decided to try to add a page of additional information for as many settlers as possible with pre-1820 data taken only from primary sources. So these are the additional information. And note that it says this is pre-1820 information only, mainly taken from actual images of UK parish registers and other primary sources which I've personally researched. Further information about the settlers and their family once they reached the Cape can be found at 1820settlers.com, Paul Tremaine's site. I didn't try to reinvent the wheel, and obviously not being a South African myself, my knowledge of what happened to them in South Africa, apart from my own family, is very limited. So this is a sample page for John Kirkman. I found the baptisms of Hannah, Albert, Mary, Margaret and Martha, the children of John and Mary Kirkman, listed in the Settler Handbook, as well as the baptism of a further child who died prior to 1820. So they're listed at the top. And notice that I also give in bold the name of the repository where you can find this information. Sources in South Africa listed the wife of John Kirkman as a Mary Alice Ashworth, with a marriage in Cheshire. And this appears to have originated from a submitted IGI entry. But there's no gravestone or death notice to prove Mary's maiden name. However, there is a marriage in the Collegiate Church of St Mary, St Denis and St George, later Manchester Cathedral, where their first child was baptised, which seemed to me a much more likely match. I consulted with the late Peter Kirkman, and together we decided that I was correct in my assumption, especially as Peter consulted a handwriting expert and compared the signature of John Kirkman on the Manchester marriage to Mary Heels with John's signature on the 1823 settler statement, which I'd transcribed as part of the settler correspondence. Now, this settler statement was sent to the government 3 years after arrival in the colony, outlining their circumstances and grievances, and was signed by a vast number of settlers. The document which I transcribed in the National Archives had the original signatures of these settlers, and the transcription can be found in a section for post-1820 correspondence on the website under S. Note that this S section also contains the correspondence for William Shepherd, who brought out more settlers in 1826, many of them relations to the original settlers who'd been left behind. So this is a section of the signatures list attached to the settler statement. It contains the name of Samuel Burt and Richard Bradshaw, who were not included on the settler return for Bradshaw's party, but who always maintained that they were original settlers. Often when last-minute replacements were made prior to sailing, the new emigrants simply sailed under a different name rather than risk losing their passage. I published transcriptions on the public eGGSA website rather than the original images to avoid infringing any copyright. But I did post pictures of all these signatures from the settler statement on the closed 1820 settler Facebook group. So if you're members of Facebook, just put in a search for settler signatures and you should be able to find all the pages. Now, the settlers were unable to take much with them on the voyage. This is a Bible and a watch taken out by Stephen Brown, probably typical of the few possessions allowed on board. The settler correspondence is full of letters asking for permission to take out implements and tools of trade, but most were rejected. Robert Godlinton, later the proprietor of the Grahamstown Journal, did apparently manage to sail with a printing press, though it was confiscated. Wendy Beale Preston, in her book Story of a Frontier Family concerning the Miles family, writes, most of the settlers came to their port of embarkation in farm carts and wagons, carrying some small pieces of furniture and a few cherished possessions, with their clothes and bedding in boxes. Bedding for the voyage had been provided by the authorities. The leaders of the parties took pigs, fowls, and a few sheep in crates, which were put up on deck. The men also had tools required for building and carpentry, and seeds for future grain crops and vegetables. The women took a few trusted home remedies, precious pieces of china and linen, some seeds of beloved English cottage garden flowers. One English mother gave each of her daughter a rose bush from her garden to take with her when she married. In this way, the English moss rose came to the Eastern Cape, and some of the older farm gardens, including that of the writer, still have them. But for many of the settlers, the most tangible link with home was the name they gave to their farm or village in the new colony. I've been able to verify the baptism or marriage of several settlers with common names, because the farm name on the UK document was the same as the farm name in South Africa. So where did the settlers come from? Of course, there were huge contingents from London and Ireland, but almost every county in England sent at least one settler. As my contribution to the bicentennial, my husband and I travelled around as many UK venues as possible with known links to settlers, taking photographs of things that might have been there in 1820. And these have now been put on the website with library photographs of venues which I've been unable to visit. And if we click on cities, it brings up the icons for the cities of Birmingham, Bristol, Dublin, Edinburgh, Liverpool, Manchester, and Nottingham, all of which had multiple settlers. To avoid the files being too big, London's been subdivided into boroughs, and the additional pages for each settler should indicate in which borough births and marriages took place. And you'll note in the case of Liverpool here, I've included quite a few historical pictures. This is because in the cities in particular, very little is left of the buildings and landscapes that would have been there in 1820. And even the older churches were often bombed during the war or altered beyond recognition in the Victorian period. So this is a picture of Our Lady in St. Nicholas Church in Liverpool in 1824. And below the photograph are the previous and next photos in the file. And you'll see a picture of the current church to the left and the interior to the right. And the text below each photograph links it to one or more settlers. This text reads, Our Lady in St. Nicholas Church and St. George's Basin Kirk at 1824, from an engraving by H. Meyer. On Sunday, the 11th of February, 1810, the spire collapsed into the nave during a service, killing 25 people. The church was badly damaged in World War II, but rebuilt. William Bold and Mary Southwood, parents of John Bold the settler, were married in St. Nicholas, as were James Kidd and Anne Jenkins, and Charles Tudor and Bridget Parker. Henry and Margaret Hyam, stepdaughters of William Griffiths, were baptized here in 1805 and 1807. Pictures of the original church in 1750 and before the collapse of the spire in 1810 can be found here. And note that at the bottom there's a download button to download the picture. All the pictures on this site can be freely downloaded, even the library pictures, which are either used under Creative Commons licenses or the public domain. And then if you click on here, you get a picture of the original church. Where I was unsure of copyright issues, I inserted a link to the website rather than copying the picture. So if we go back to the original Settler Places in Britain website, which can be found on the left-hand side under the 1820 Settlers logo, if you click on the English flag, it brings up a list of all the English counties. And the county names from 1820 have been used. Hence, there's no Cumbria, but rather Cumberland and Westmoreland. And in the villages, it's usually the churches that would have been there in 1820. Where a church was altered considerably in the Victorian era, I've tried to indicate in the blurb which part, usually the tower, date from an earlier time. However, there are pictures of pubs, thatched cottages, canals, views, etc., which would have been pretty close to what the 1820 settlers knew. And I've tried where possible to get pictures of places, farm buildings, where the settlers duplicated the names at the Cape. And this is Radway Green Farm in Bartomley, where William Ford was brought up. Sorry, if I just go back to the previous. That's also Radway Green Farm, which is under Cheshire. And then if you click on the Cheshire icon, it will bring up a list of all the towns and village covered, bearing in mind that Nottinghamshire only covers the county area. The city of Nottingham, home to so many settlers, has a separate entry under cities. So here are some more places with settler connections a little stronger than simply the village where they lived or the church in which they were baptized or married. This is another picture of Radway Green Farm today, home of William Ford. This is Belhag Farm in Derbyshire, where George and William Clayton grew up. It's now a ruin on the site of a nursery and seed business carrying the Belhag Farm name. This is the Saracen's Head in Southwell. Many of the Nottinghamshire settlers would have stopped for a drink here, and they later settled in Southwell at the Cape. And this is Standerwick Court in Somerset, with Standerwick at the Cape on the right-hand side. William Bartlett was a gardener at Standerwick Court prior to emigration and lived at Standerwick at the Cape with his wife Selina Hayward, and the Trollope family also lived at Standerwick. This is Belmont Farm in Ipstone, Staffordshire, home of the Reverend William Carlisle, father of the Carlisle brothers who led a party of settlers to the Cape. And this is Manor Farm, South Newton in Wiltshire, the address from which Miles Bowker wrote most of his correspondence with the Colonial Office. It's adjacent to St Andrew's Church, where Mary Elizabeth, his youngest daughter, was baptised. And this is Stepcot Hill in Exeter, Devon. Stepcot Hill is a medieval cobbled street in Exeter that doubtless would have been well known to members of Parkin's party. John Parkin was living on Stepcot Hill when his infant daughter Isabella was buried in the adjacent St Mary's Steps Church in 1818. William Clogg was living on Stepcot Hill in 1817 when his son William was baptised in nearby St John's. And this is Blakelaw Farm, Linton, Roxburghshire in Scotland. William Dodds Pringle, Catherine Heatley Pringle and Beatrice Scott Pringle were born here. The millstone has a date of 1846, so wouldn't have been there in 1820, but the farm still has much the same view over the countryside. Settlers, of course, did not as a rule die in the UK, but sometimes I've been able to photograph the graves of their parents, grandparents, or even great-grandparents. And these are all included on the settler location site. This is one of many Damont and Guybon graves in St Andrew's Church, Lammas, Norfolk. And these are graves from St Buddock in Buddock, Cornwall, graves of 3 generations of Peter Renfreys. The grave on the left is the grave of Peter and Elizabeth Renfrey, grandparents of the settler Joseph Richards. Peter Renfrey was also the older brother of Miriam Renfrey, mother of the settler James J. Ava. And the grave on the right is of 2 further generations. There were, of course, many settlers from Ireland, particularly from Dublin, Cork and Longford. Sadly, I've never been to Ireland, though it's on my bucket list. So I've had to content myself with a few library pictures on the site for now. This is a picture taken of Temple Michael Parish Church in Longford by Dean McClelland, which he kindly allowed me to use. John Armstrong married Catherine Forbes in this church, and the children of Moses Armstrong and Jane Kilby were baptised here, as were the children of Edward Forbes and the children of William Scanlon and Hannah Ross. Francis McClelland was appointed clerk to the curate of Temple Michael Church in February 1819. Francis's father, Frederick McClelland, married Margaret Beattie in Temple Michael Church in 1785, and a church was built in 1710 with some alterations about 1812, for which the architect was an M. McClelland. There are relatively few pictures of Ireland on the site, and Irish settlers are also the most difficult to trace, as many had common names, and many Irish records were lost during the Civil War in 1922, when a fire ravaged the record office. But at present, there are nearly 1,800 UK pictures on the settler location pages, and more are being added all the time. Now, obviously, when tracing UK roots, it's always best to consult original documents where possible, and that's what I've tried to do in order to obtain the information on the extra information pages of the website. Family Search is free to use and does now take baptisms and marriages from primary sources, so it's much more reliable than the old IGI. Irish records are problematical, but some Catholic records are freely searchable online. Scotland has very good genealogical records, but they are all on a pay-per-view site at Scotland's People. But it's possible to buy credits at a reasonable rate with a credit card, and you don't need an annual subscription. For England and Wales, there are two main pay-per-view sites which have images of original records. Find My Past offers credits rather than a subscription as well, and has a very good collection of original Welsh records, as well as those held by the Archives of Canterbury Cathedral covering West Kent. You can see Canterbury collection there. Ancestry has perhaps the largest collection of original parish registers. It is pay-per-view, but you can take out a trial subscription. Note that Nottinghamshire has recently been added. It's always worth looking in the card catalogue for what's new, but not all the Nottinghamshire parishes are there yet. And here are some other websites that might give you some information about a settler. Sometimes settlers seem to come from more well-to-do, educated families where the settler had a skilled trade or his own business. But a quick search of the London Gazette, however, which is free, will often reveal that the individual concerned had filed for bankruptcy in the year prior to emigration. And the Gazette also published details of military promotions and appointments. And here you'll see I've put Thomas Price Adams into the search engine. And when you click on search, it brings up various snippets of proceedings of bankruptcy, which list addresses where he lived and worked. And this is the website of the British Newspaper Archive, where you can search papers from all over the UK. That's also a pay-per-view site, but if you scroll right down to the bottom of this page, you can find a button which says, try it for free. And this allows you free searching and 3 downloads before you have to pay. Now, very often, the first clue to the birthplace of a settler is found on his death notice, most of which can be found on Family Search. Beware, however, even when a likely birth or marriage for the parents has been located in the correct county, it's always worth following up to check that it doesn't refer to someone else with the same name. This is a copy of the death notice for William Aldred, an independent settler who emigrated with his wife Elizabeth Farrand and children. His death notice confirms his wife's name and says he was born in Suffolk. Most online trees have his baptism in St Margaret's, Lowestoft on the 7th of July 1781, son of Jabez and Rachel Aldred. That's that one on the right-hand side. The dates certainly fit, and the names are not common, so it's easy to see why this baptism was adopted by descendants. However, I'm not convinced this is the right baptism. The original records for Lowestoft, Suffolk, are actually online via the Norfolk Record Office, who hold copies. And there's a marriage on the 9th of September 1802 in St Margaret's, Lowestoft, between a William Aldred and a Martha Gardner, the marriage being witnessed by Jabez Aldred, who went on to have children baptized in the Independent Chapel in Ipswich, and the first child was baptized Rachel Emma after her grandmother, so they were not connected to the settler William Aldred at all. Now, more and more UK records are coming online all the time, so if you're stuck on where a settler originated, it's always worth putting in another search. Often the bride would return to her parents for the birth of the first child, but then return home for the baptism. So, for example, if William Aldred was born in Suffolk, he need not necessarily have been baptized in Suffolk. And where someone was said to be born in a particular county, he might well have been baptized in a church just over the border in a neighbouring county. So I hope that if you have 1820 ancestors, you'll find something interesting on my pages on eGGSA. And please do contact me if you find any errors, or if you have anything I can add that can be verified by primary sources. But I'll stop there and answer any questions if I can.
Sue, thank you very much. That was fascinating. And as being a descendant of Miles Barker, I was delighted to see that picture of the house in South Newton. Now, I could have fallen off my chair because I've been looking for that picture for years, and including my cousins as well. Would there be a recording of this fantastic presentation so I can get that picture of the house in South Newton?
Yes, the house in South Newton is actually on the website, so you can download it freely from there.
Oh, really? Okay, all right.
And
Okay,
there are pictures also of places relating to Miles Bowker in Dorset, where his earlier children were baptized. There's some nice pictures of the church there.
So now I've got a question. You said your ancestors were here in South Africa and there were 1820 settlers and there were 3 of them. And now what happened? You left?
Yes, it's I'm an 1820 settler descendant through my mother. And she was born and brought up in South Africa. But my father went out, ironically, he went out at the age of 18 to learn farming under the 1820 settler training farm. But that was in the 30s, and they were in George in 1938 when they met and decided to get married. But my father then decided he wanted to give up farming and become an actor, and he went over to London to train at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, and my mother went with him, newly married, and they never went back.
Okay.
So I was totally born and brought up in the UK.